Hey there again, guys. It's Mr. Hefner, and today we're bringing you this lesson from the beautiful White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. Beautiful day here. We've got clouds passing by, but we're going to be talking about our first unit. So I always like to do a unit launch where I give you an overview of the unit. And so these are often called the elements of. These are the literary terms that you're going to need to understand and be able to apply as we go through this unit. On these slideshows that I have to introduce units, you'll notice down here there is it looks like a picture of Cornell note sheet with a circle around it. That's exactly what it is. Whenever you see that on a slide, that means that I really suggest that the basic idea of this slide should be somewhere in your Cornell notes if you're taking them. You can use those Cornell notes on tests. You can use them to study, and you get the 10 extra credit points on the test if you have them. Sometimes you'll see this image down here, but there'll be a slash across it. You're always welcome to take Cornell notes, but sometimes it's just a little enrichment piece, a digression, in which case it's not anything that's a core part of the course. You wouldn't be tested on it. It's okay to have it in your notes, but you don't need to. All right, so let's get started here. Our first unit, we're going to be doing literature in this 9th grade English class according to genre. Genres are the categories that writing goes in. So like the novel is a genre, the short story is a genre, maybe the screenplay is a genre, poetry is a genre. And so we're gonna start off with the oldest type of literature that there is, and that is folk literature. The folk tradition it's called in this unit. And folk literature is generally told by word of mouth from one person to another, sometimes from one generation, like a grandparent to a grandchild, and then they pass that on later. Sometimes folk literature started out with an author, but as it's been passed along and sent down the lines, the name of the author gets lost, and we just all know it. Some things, like everybody knows the happy birthday song, right? Happy birthday to you. That's the one we're all singing twice as we wash our hands during COVID. We actually know who wrote that song. If we research it, I don't know, but we have record of who wrote that song, and yet everybody knows it without ever looking at sheet music or without ever giving credit to the author. So it's really become folk tradition stuff. So oral tradition is another name for the folk tradition, and oral transmission is the way this stuff gets passed along. Now, in Schoology, I have scanned all the stories that we're going to be reading, everything we're going to be taking a look at, including the introduction to this unit, and that would be page 4. So everything we're doing today comes from a section that starts on page 4 in the anthology that I have scanned into Schoology for you guys. All right, so in this unit, we're going to take a look at a number of different subgenres, different types of folklore. We're going to be taking a look, first of all, in the course at 2 myths. We're going to read the story of Echo and Narcissus, and another one called Daedalus and Icarus. One is Greek, the other is Roman, although it really started out as a Greek myth. Myths are stories that we're told to explain things about the world, things in the natural world. They involve symbolism, they involve gods and goddesses and great power. And not to offend anyone, but all religion falls into the category of myths, because that's what religion is about. It's to explain things about the world. Another thing we're going to be doing in our legends, and legends are sort of an extension of myths. So myths generally have no basis in anything that actually happened. They were created to explain the unexplainable in the world. Legends, though, usually have some basis in some actual event, something that happened, or some person that actually lived. Over time, though, as people told these stories through oral tradition, they got embellished, more got added, and things like that. And so by the end of the whole thing, you have legends that involve a bit of mythology much of the time. They may involve some exaggeration part of the time. Everybody, I think you understand, you've probably heard the story of George Washington, how he was a young boy and his father gave him a brand new axe as a present. And the little boy, in wanting to use that axe, went out and chopped down his favorite cherry tree. And the father said, "What happened to my cherry tree?" And George Washington said, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down your cherry tree." We know that never happened, right? we're pretty darn sure anyway that that never happened. But we know there was a George Washington, and we know that George Washington had a reputation for being honest and telling the truth. And so that is a legend. In this course, we're going to read a legend called the Silver Pool. A lot of people know Greek legends, like the legends of Odysseus coming home from the Trojan War, but we're actually going to read an Irish legend. And if you know Irish culture, you'll know that the hero, they call him Finn McCool. It looks like Finn McCumhale, but they pronounce it Finn McCool. He's like a superhero in the Celtic tradition. We're going to take a look at some folk tales. Folk tales come to us from all around the world. We're going to read one called Goha and the Pot. It's always got, I shouldn't say always, often has a trickster character in it, teaches a lesson by the end. They're told to entertain, but they're also told to teach a lesson. We're going to look at tall tales. Tall tales are just exaggeration. So they often start out with something and the hero becomes totally unrealistic, superpower, super tall, able to do things like move rivers and things like that. We're also going to read a fairy tale. And we all know the Disney versions of fairy tales, but those Disney versions were really cleaned up and sanitized so that they could be presented to modern day children. We're going to take a look at some really dark fairy tales. Fairy tales were often told not to entertain, but to scare children into being good children. And I think you're going to like the dark side of the fairy tale. Another thing we're going to take a look at is a story called a parable. Parables are stories that use symbols to teach a lesson. And some people believe that parables were created so that only those who were truly worthy, only those who could see past the symbols and understand the message in the story could understand. We're going to take a look at fables. Fables are very much like parables. They also use symbols to teach a story with a lesson, except that fables always use animals as the symbols. There are other symbols too, but they use animals to represent different types of people. We're also going to look at some folk songs. I'll try to figure out a way that we can actually play them and hear them with music and things like that. But folk songs are songs that people teach to one another and sing, and they spread by word of mouth, not by reading sheet music or something like that. They're generally not recorded, and because they get passed from one person to another, generation to generation, they often grow different versions of themselves. You know, when I was a kid growing up, I always used to hear my dad singing songs that were on the radio, and it must have been his hearing, but his lyrics were not the ones that were on the radio, you know, what he was hearing. It's kind of like Jimi Hendrix, you know, that line, "Excuse me while I kiss the sky," sounded to a lot of people like, "Excuse me while I kiss this guy." All right. And so what happens with oral tradition is that different versions emerge, and it's always fun looking back to see what we've collected over the years. We're going to take a look at spirituals. Spirituals are also songs, but these were songs that were sung by African slaves that were brought to America. Generally, they were the people who worked in the fields. When I've never been a slave, thank God, but I can imagine that for somebody to be in slavery, the one thing you always look for is, will there be freedom one day? And so for these slaves in the South who were often taught, you know, Christianity, many of them looked to Moses, who led the Israelites to freedom, and they're waiting for their Moses. And so there are often religious overtones in these spirituals that go back to the Old Testament. All right, just to check your understanding really quickly, I always like to go through a couple quick checks at the end, and this prepares you for any questions that may come up later. Let's take a quick look here. Let's see if we can match these up. So we've got myth, tall tale, legend, oral tradition, and spiritual. And then we have 6 choices at the bottom here. So let's do them one at a time. Which one of these at the bottom best explains what a myth is right here? Okay, produced by a culture as a way of explaining objects or events in nature. Good job. Which one is the best example of a tall tale? So this would be an exaggeration. All right. In this case, we've got George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. And I don't like that question because just a moment ago we said that's a legend. It's a legend and a tall tale. So that's perfectly okay for that one to be in there. How about a legend then? What are legends? They're sort of like myths, but what makes them different? Oh, that's a mistake. Look at that. Okay, sorry about that. What we've actually got here for the legend is we've got stories that may contain elements of fantasy, but are generally based on real people or events. If I could change that right now, I would, but I can't change it at this point. Oral tradition, we're up to that one right here. Oral tradition, the passing of stories, poems, songs by word of mouth, hence the word oral in there. And a spiritual is a type of song. And so again, down here, we have songs that often refer to passages in the Bible. So that would be a spiritual. So everything on this screen is correct right now, except for legend. These two, I don't know, I got the same one in the same place, but legend should be stories that may contain elements of fantasy, but are generally based on real events or people. How about some other questions? Haste makes waste. Somebody comes up, says that to you. What that means is if you're too quick to try to get something done, you do it wrong, it's a waste, and you need to do it again anyway. That's an example of myth. True or false? Yeah, that's false. That would be an example of a proverb. A witty short saying. A theme is a central idea in a literary work. True or false? That's true. Now, this was not one of the things we covered in the introduction here, but you should know theme going all the way back to elementary school. And theme exists in all literature. So if you write a story, your story is going to have a theme. But even in the oral tradition, themes are ever prevalent. A refrain is found only in a song, and repetitions found only in poetry. Again, these are two literary terms, refrain and repetition, that you're going to need to know. And they apply to the spirituals and the folk songs. But the reality is you can have a refrain in poetry, and you can have repetition in any kind of literature. So that would be a false statement. The oral tradition in the United States has its origin in Native American culture, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And we are, in fact, a nation of immigrants. And so, yeah, our culture brings oral tradition from all around the world. Exaggerated stories about Pecos Bill's cowboy skills and Paul Bunyan. I don't know if you're familiar with Pecos Bill and Paul Bunyan, but they were two great early American heroes who could do almost anything. Paul Bunyan was giant. Pecos Bill could like round up a whole herd of cattle all by himself. And so, yes, those would be tall tales, so not legends. All right, so that's the end of this quick introduction, the video introduction. What you want to do is you want to go into Schoology and check out the rest of the lesson for today. You might have a little quiz to take. You might have a few questions to answer, but good luck with those.